Welcome back to the second video on moral objectivism, and in this video we're going to take a look at this doctrine of double effect, which is an extension of the concepts associated with moral objectivism. So as we get into the doctrine of double effect, basically what we're looking at is a situation where we are working with moral objectivism, these natural laws, this idea that there are going to be distinct rules that apply to all individuals in all situations at all periods of time. What happens if those rules or those guiding principles come into conflict with one another? What should you do when an action has two outcomes or two effects associated with it? And so, examples on the slide here. Do not enter, entrance only. Not a through street, but it's an evacuation route. Stop, keep moving. We're getting conflicting instructions. We've got basically, what do you do? You're faced with making a decision, but that decision may come into conflict with one of the other principles or one of the other rules that you're going to be operating with. So what happens in this concept of the doctrine of double effect? What happens when you cannot do good without causing evil, or at least something bad, to happen as a consequence? So an example of this that's often used in philosophical and ethical discussions is the trolley problem, originally put forth by English philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967. You've got a trolley that's coming down the track, and if you don't do something, 4 people are going to die, or at least an increased number of people are going to die. If you take action, throwing the lever over here, you're going to save 4 people at the expense of an innocent bystander, at the expense of somebody who is not at risk originally, but in an effort to save more people, you're putting that person at risk. What do? Do you save 4 people by killing 1 person? And what do you do in a situation like that? That's the question of a doctrine of double effect. And we've seen this in literature. It's a common trope that's used to introduce a scenario. In Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, musical version of it, was on Broadway for a number of years, well-received book. If we take a look at this, in the basis of this story, what we have is that, I'm not sure if he's a hero or anti-hero, but Jean Valjean, he's faced with his nieces starving. And so in order to provide food for his nieces, what he has to do is go steal a loaf of bread. And so you are in a situation. Do you allow your nieces to starve, or do you break the law and steal the bread? And so he steals a loaf of bread. He's captured, sentenced to jail, escapes a few times, has a number of years added on the sentence, and kind of continues on from there. But again, the situation about what can you do if you're faced with a situation where you have no outcome. In Les Miserables, you let your nieces starve, or you break the law and steal a loaf of bread. Okay, so now we're coming into a conflict. We've got these, again, within this view of moral objectivism, we've got this idea that there are ethical principles that are going to be present, that are applying to all people in all situations at all times. But now what we're ending up with is the fact that they could be applied differently in different different contexts. And so basically, this concept of ethical situationalism, we've got ethical principles that are in conflict with one another. Do you kill 1 person to save 4? Do you steal bread to provide food for your nieces? And so what you have to do is not make a decision versus right or wrong. You have to make a decision based on the situation in order to determine what is the most moral action under these distinct circumstances. So we've been dancing around this concept, but basically the concept we're talking about is that when two moral rules come into conflict with one another, we end up with a dilemma. And this is described in philosophical terms as the doctrine of double effect. What happens when you cannot do good without bringing about evil consequences? And so the doctrine of double effect is often discussed in association with Sir Thomas Aquinas, who worked to combine Aristotelian philosophy with Augustinian theology in an effort to come up with an answer. Now, I started introducing this concept of the doctrine of double effect with the trolley problem. You've got a trolley barreling down the tracks. If you do nothing, it's going to kill 4 people. If you act, you're going to save 4 people, but you're going to cause the death of an innocent person. That's not just an abstract theory. An example of this occurred in June 2003 when 31 train cars escaped from a Montclair, California freight yard. So basically, they were in a yard. They were decoupled from the engine that would basically kind of pull them along, and then they started to roll downhill. And they weren't just rolling downhill; they were rolling downgrade through Los Angeles. And they were faced with a couple situations. They had to make a decision as to what to do. They could allow this runaway train, or at least this runaway train cars, to stay in the main track, and they're going to go through Los Angeles into the Los Angeles freight yard, and potentially crash into a Metrolink passenger train, commuter traffic line. They could divert it at milepost 11.4, where it would cross the tracks for high-speed trains carrying freight, for Amtrak, kind of greater kind of transportation, kind of more than just the regional rails, like the Metrolink. They could divert it onto another track, but that would risk a head-on collision with a 93-car train of hazardous materials. And so, maybe you're not just going to kill people, but you're going to run into this train, have a massive derailment, spilling of these hazardous materials, and we've looked at different examples of that in recent history. And then an alternative is to divert onto track 4, a different, path, but that would give it a maximum speed of about 15 miles per hour, and that runaway train is likely to derail. And so basically what happened is that this train, runaway train, crashed. Ultimately, it destroyed 3 residences, damaged 5 others. 13 people suffered minor injuries, and it did about $2.4 million in damages. But as you can see, of these options, there's no one clear option that is the distinct, clear way of what they need to be doing. There's good things and bad things in each one of these situations. And so a real-life example of this doctrine of double effect. So as I mentioned before, St. Thomas Aquinas is attributed for studying this doctrine of double effect. And basically, they've been able to come up with 4 conditions in which you need to consider if a morally permissible effect, the action can be occurring within this doctrine of double effect. Basically, how do you choose what it is that you're going to be doing? The first is that the nature of the act condition must be either morally good or neutral. And so basically, the action must be beneficial or at least not causing additional damage. And this gives rise to the means-end condition. And so the means-end condition is this idea that you shouldn't take a incorrect or improper action just as a means to get to a good effect. And so doing something bad or doing something evil is not to be undertaken just to get a good outcome at the end. Now, the continuation of what you need to consider for determining what it is you should do if you have 2 moral principles that are at odds with one another, this concept of a doctrine of double effect. We need to have a right intention condition, And so the good outcome is the intention. And so we're trying to do good. We're trying to have a beneficial outcome that is going to be favorable at the end. And if there's a bad consequence, the trolley car problem, the bad consequence, the killing of the innocent person, should be an unintended side effect. Now, in the trolley car problem, we know if we flip that lever, it is going to be direct action. And so potentially that would be not allowed under the doctrine of double effect, that we shouldn't cause this bad outcome, this bad consequence to occur. And then potentially at odds with this is the proportionality condition. The good effect that must be achieved must be at least equivalent in importance or weight to the bad consequence. And so you could argue that maybe you should flip the lever on our trolley car problem because the good effect, saving 4 people, is at least as important or at least equivalent to the bad consequence of killing 1 person by flipping that lever. But as you can see, there's no clear clear answer. It's something that is now difficult to determine because you're weighing these different principles and trying to determine which of these principles outweighs the other. Okay, so thank you for listening to this video on more objectivism and the doctrine of double effect. Come back for part 3, where we're going to take a look at some core morality principles.